It's easier to imagine a world without man than a spring without flowers. And yet there were Aprils without them. But when they did come blooming in crustacean times, they came with a profusion and hardiness that was unrelenting. The 10-ton dinosaurs who reigned upon the land about the time of the coming of the first flowers proved to be no match on the evolutionary scale for something as delightful and as seemingly delicate as the daisy. 135 million years later, a man named Roy Bedichek, was clearly reverent in his approach to the tiniest bluegilia. One evening, after a spring walk in the limestone hills of central Texas, he sat down and he wrote, "It does seem to me a miracle that from the bones of tiny organisms, deposited millions of years ago on the floor of an ancient sea, that there should now rise to greet the sun a little flower marked by such ingenious and beautiful workmanship." Today, flowers overwhelmingly dominate the land, composing 96% of all vascular plants. Of the 250,000 species of flowers, you can find about 5,000 growing in Texas. Spring is a good time to catch them, as Jim Bones has done here with his camera. Now, the flowering cottonwood is not a good example of what we're talking about. It blooms early to make seeds, then drops the seeds in cottony little parachutes, hoping, instinctively, one supposes, that the March winds will distribute them. This does seem ingenious, and is certainly aeronautical enough to suit our sense of engineering, but it is really a relatively wasteful and inefficient means of fertilization. Most flowers, the ones that have covered the earth for millions of years, use their lovely blooms and scent to attract insects and birds to carry their pollen. What bee could pass up the nectar of the red sage, one of the earliest bloomers, and a sure sign, incidentally, that there will not be another frost until next year? All this budding and seeding and pollination is not a lovely madness practiced exclusively by the birds and bees and flowers. We are all touched by spring's cupid arrow. "Spring at last," some Ibid wrote, "and all hell's afire. Life is stirring from winter's nap, and the sap moves in us as well as in the trees. The sun warms, the rain quenches, and the moon, the overlord of life's rhythms, glows benignly in the evening sky. The urge to plant is irresistible, to plant the seed of a child, or even a carrot. Oddly enough, city folk feel it, and rush to parks and seed stores and nurseries to conjure up whatever they can. We know of but two men in all of history who didn't share the general enthusiasm for spring. They were Uncle John Stentor of New Hampshire and the poet Ogden Nash. Both agreed that spring's a season much overrated to those already mated. Eccentric Yankees through and through. There was another New England poet, however, who, although cloistered, made more fun of it. Her name was Emily Dickinson, and among other things, she wrote, "A little madness in the spring is wholesome even for the king." Happily enough, the madness even runs through botanists, who, in the winter of their discontent, roam far afield, flinging monstrous Latin expletives at passive plants. In spring, however, they come to their symbiotic senses and call flowers by more sympathetic names. The Hediotis crassifolia becomes a forget-me-not, the Camelina augustifolia a widow's tears. Sophora segundiflora is the big drunk bean. In the blur of pinks and reds and yellows are beard tongues and mimosa, copper mallows and Indian blankets, cliff salvias and bladder pods. There are honeysuckle and wine cups, Venus tears and sweet williams, and indeed, everything upon the land is brighter and sweeter. Every flower of the field, Sir Thomas Blount said about 278 years ago, Every fiber of a plant, every particle of an insect, carries with it the impress of its maker and can, if duly considered, read us lectures of ethics or divinity. Sir Thomas was saying something that would be scientifically supported 150 years later by Charles Darwin and his disciples. The evolutionist was not contradicting the preacher, as has been popularly supposed. Rather, they were agreeing that there was a logic and a law in nature that bound the simplest forms of life with the highest. This moth, floating to its destruction in the spring thunderstorm, is clearly a victim of the forces of nature. Darwin and his survival of the fittest comes to mind. And yet this is deluded Darwin in only a partial view, a mere byplay of nature's endeavor. The larger focus is clearly one of mutual dependence, solidarity, and cooperation. For every moth drowned in a pond or trapped in a spider's web, there are millions who make it to pollinate the flowers and please the eye. The flowers would not spring up without the rain, and the caterpillar would remain a wintry worm and never grow wings to fly if it were not for the sun. And if the caterpillar eats a lily to live, he will later make it up and more as a nectar-bearing butterfly flitting from flower to flower. The whole must be seen, not as a still photograph, but as a motion picture, is plot, counterplot, and drama of the limitless fecundity of nature, of unbelievably clever stratagems and devices, of infinite mutations and protean adaptability, all unfolding in an endless flow of time. We're all one, all melted together, Darwin wrote in his notebook as a young man. Later, he ended his monumental work, The Origin of the Species, with these two very Victorian but beautiful sentences. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.